we've got this combination of much higher inflation. The OBR, I think inflation might be its highest level for 30 years. Big tax rises. Don't forget, they weren't announced yesterday, but earlier this year, we've had very, very big tax increases announced, and wages rising relatively gradually. So that means probably that in a year's time, someone on average earnings will be a bit less well off than they are today. And that's not obviously conducive to a feel-good factor if you're actually feeling worse off.
Let's talk about universal credit. Do you think this taper offsets the loss of money from cutting that £20 uplift?
Well, it does if you are working full-time on the minimum wage or on relatively low earnings. Then for most people in that situation, they're going to be gaining £1,000 a year or more from the reduction in the taper. So that does offset the £20 a week cut. If, however, you are on universal credit and out of work, so if you're unemployed or disabled, for example, then this doesn't help you at all. And this is really part of quite a long-term and very long-term sort of rebalancing of our welfare system, which supports people in work, but increasingly is really quite mean to people who are out of work.
You said that the policy choices were unrelated to the pandemic. How can we have a budget which, for all intents and purposes, is being delivered while we're still in the pandemic, with policy choices that are unrelated to the pandemic?
I think the point is that the spending increases that were announced were always going to be necessary, pandemic or no pandemic. So the long-term rate of increase for NHS spending, whilst in the short run, it's getting more than it might have done. In the long run, there's no more there than we otherwise would have had. And the increases on things like schools and the justice system and prisons and so on, everyone could see that those were necessary, again, pandemic or no pandemic. So those spending increases, I think, would have happened in the medium run anyway. And the tax rises were there to pay for that, and in particular to pay for the increased health spending. I mean, to be honest, these are changes that we have said for quite a number of years now were eventually going to be inevitable. And I think what we've had really is the Chancellor taking the opportunity of the pandemic to introduce these changes, which I think were pretty hard to avoid in any case.
Talking of taxes, there were no green taxes that were announced. Were you surprised by that?
Not terribly surprised, because we haven't had much in the way of green taxes for some time. Don't forget, this is the 12th year in a row that fuel duties have been frozen. I don't think there was any likelihood that we were going to get a tax on gas consumption at home, for example, not least because of the very high increases in gas prices. And don't forget, that's what what would green taxes mean? Well, the two big things they would mean would be an increase in the cost of heating your home with gas and an increase in the cost of driving. Now, it's not in the least bit surprising that for political reasons, that's not likely to happen.
So if you look at the reductions in air passenger duty and that fuel duty freeze that you were talking about, do you think that will actively contribute to actually more carbon being emitted?
Well, making driving cheaper than it otherwise would have been, and driving in particular petrol and diesel cars, will have a small effect in that direction. I think the APD duty changes for various technical reasons probably won't make much difference at all. So yes, possibly a small negative impact there, but really very small relative to the sorts of things the government's doing elsewhere outside of the tax system. So big increases in green electricity over the last decade, and we are genuinely moving to electric vehicles. We'll have to all new cars will have to be electric by 2030. So I wouldn't overstate the consequences of not having green taxes. I think for understandable reasons, the government is using a different set of tools to get us there. In some of these instances, that's still going to be very, very hard. I mean, how we move away from gas heating, despite some of the money that's been allocated, for example, to air source heat pumps, I think is still very uncertain.
Let's talk about alcohol. The simplification of the alcohol duty system it was announced, but do you think people are actually going to feel that in the pub?
Well, the changes for most drinks will be relatively small. I mean, there will be some reasonably significant increases in, for example, the cost of strong stronger red wines. There'll be some reasonably significant reductions in the costs of sparkling wines. Not too much. I mean, not enough difference, I think, in the duty on most beers to for people in the pub to see a great deal of difference. I mean, what we have, what the Chancellor is doing, I think, is long overdue. I mean, we've long had a system which taxes alcohol at very different rates, which effectively encouraged people to consume stronger drinks with more alcohol in them relative to drinks with less alcohol in them. And it will remain the case that if you want to, if you want to drink too much and not pay much to the taxman, then stick to cider, which has always been the case and rather strangely will remain the case under this new system.
You opened your comments this morning by saying it was a once-in-a-decade event. Why did you think that, Paul?
Well, I think if we look over this year, we've had this huge increase in taxes, £40 billion. We've also had this very big increase in spending, and that's after the long period of spending cuts that we saw under the coalition and Conservative governments. And I think this year has seen this acknowledgement that we're in a new world where the state is just going to be a bit bigger than it's been in the past. An acknowledgement that we're spending more on the health service because that's clearly what is demanded by the population, and an acknowledgement that more is needed for a number of other public services. And I think that sets this budget alongside, for example, George Osborne's first one, where he set out the path to austerity, or one of Gordon Brown's early ones, where you saw taxes and spending increases set out there. I think this is resetting fiscal policy in quite a big way.